Well, I want to switch gears a little bit because you are a man of many talents. And one of the things you do besides play the organ is you teach music theory.
Mhm.
And if there's anything that's less understood by the human public than the organ, it's music theory. So let's talk about that. What is music theory?
It's almost as if I could say it's like the math behind music. So, music theory is a desired set of statements that we can make about a certain body of music that show up as more or less true statements about a given range of music that we might experience. So, a lot of music that we experience on a common everyday basis, I would classify as what we call tonal music, a kind of standard common practice period music, music that is either uh, well represented in the classical world, everything from Bach and Mozart and Haydn, Beethoven, all the way to Brahms, but then also music that is often imagined in the popular imagination through a lot of pop music as well.
Mhm.
So the kind of formation of that music is actually based upon principles and qualities of joining sounds together in certain kinds of ways to produce certain ranges and effects of sounds, kind of scales, harmonies, chords, key systems that will give a certain predictability to that level of sound. And so the statements and the observations that have come over time regarding that music is that kind of study that we call music theory. It's more or less an observational based system where oftentimes music theory is the result of people observing a kind of body of music as it is already there and trying to find out what makes it tick, what makes it work, what are the true statements that are there that would describe accurately how that music is constructed. On occasion, music theory is actually directed the other way, where it's actually prescriptive in nature. And maybe a composer will define a way that they are going to compose a piece. They'll give themselves a kind of closed system and say, I'm only going to compose according to these principles in front of me. And then once they start actually writing that music, that set of systems becomes like the music theory that describes the music that they've created. So, as I like to describe it, music theory is, in fact, looking two ways. Most of it is descriptive, describing music that has already been composed, but a fair portion of it is actually prescriptive, actually describing music that has yet to be composed or is actively being composed.
So I think this may come as a surprise to some people who went through music school. I think the common impression of music theory is it's the rules. It's what you are supposed to do. So we study music theory so that we don't mess anything up. But you're describing it quite the opposite, that it's only prescriptive if it's what you want, if you want to use it as a tool to compose a certain way. And its main function is to explain and describe what we have already seen in music.
Exactly. And so, to the extent that there are rules that we describe, those rules really are statements that by following the rules, they will give us a high degree of predictability about the kind of sounds that are created. And those rules, they are valid if one just keeps in mind that depending upon the body of music that one is describing, say, for example, like classical music in a certain kind of time range, well, like if I want to make the music that sounds like the music of Mozart, I would try to recreate the steps that Mozart used in order to create his music. That means doing certain things, but it also means not doing certain other things. And those kind of boundary lines that we form for ourselves, it's actually quite admired in the world of music theory. It's good to have these boundaries because then it makes the definition much more clear about what we're talking about in terms of these descriptive statements.
Yeah, I have a good example of this. I, found as I learned to orchestrate over time that although, orchestrators do follow their muse and they have lots of different things they try and are experimenters, ultimately there is a base that they can operate from. And a lot of the base is music theory. It's the standard music theory rules. When you apply them to instruments, it really makes the instruments work. It makes the whole thing sound pretty good so that you don't have to kill yourself to figure out how to set a piece for the orchestra or how to write for the orchestra. And then when you want to experiment, you can stand on that as opposed to having to figure out from scratch, how do I make these strings? Where do I put them next to each other? The rules in this case support you.
Exactly so. And they're meant to be aids in further creation. That's how I view it. I regret that anybody might have a viewpoint of music theory as being just a set of rules, because to me it seems like an invitation to be creative within that, or to understand how other people were being able to be creative with that in the past, composers of the past who I admire and still hold in high esteem.
Yeah. Now you've described it mathematically. I Math is a bit of a hobby for me. I enjoy reading about math, and my experience is that math and music is not what mathematicians would particularly find interesting. It's not interesting in a math way, but there's a kind of a different kind of math in play. It's more of a structural math rather than a math of ratios or integers or even derivatives. It's more about can you talk about the math of music and what it actually is?
So the math of music, it partly depends on the level of sound creation one is kind of creating, but the relationships that we define within numbers start from assigning number systems to various pitches within a scale, and then finding different ways of describing with numbers the distances from one note to another, the so-called intervals, and then classifying those intervals as based upon what kind of activity level is kind of inherent within the sound of those intervals, whether the sound is somewhat stable, hence the term consonant, or unstable, hence the term dissonant. And it's by observing that layer of sound, whether some sound is active or kind of stable, as the case may be, that gives rise to the observation of other relationships that come about from other number systems. When we start joining together pitches into greater entities, like 3 or 4 notes together, chords, harmonies, either triads, 3-note chords, or 4-note chords, which oddly are called seventh chords. They don't have 7 notes. They have the distance of a seventh from the bottom note to the top note, as it were. And thinking, what is the kind of apparent quality of sound in terms of activity or stability that's inherent with these sounds? And then recognizing through rules of what we call counterpoint, recognizing that when you join one line of music, range of notes in one part, with another line of music in another part, and asking what is the set of interval relationships between those lines, how does that create a sense of identity within just a key system? How close do we feel to that tonal center, and how far are we getting away from that? And is there a way of predicting pathways of motion that will consistently sound good, at least in terms of our common Western experience? The number relationships that are formed with individual notes, then the intervals, then the chord structures. These are the kind of number systems that we study and define, and then predict how they'll sound.
So perhaps instead of good, we should say consistent.
I think that's a valuable point, yes,
Yeah.
because this is all relative and subjective. What sounds good to one person may actually sound unfamiliar. And not to say that something which is not pleasing in sound might not be possible that we could actually enjoy that sound later on. It's just not familiar. It's not something that we are experienced with. So if we want to go for a certain consistency of sound, there's the kind of predictability function that I'm describing from before.
Yeah. Now, in conversations with mathematicians, some of whom love music but may not necessarily be musicians, I've heard them describe music as more or less mathematical. For instance, they find Brahms more mathematical than Tchaikovsky. And yet, like I said, the math in music is fairly trivial from a mathematical point of view. It wouldn't take them very long to figure out, the numbers. It's not complex, and yet it somehow eludes them. I guess I'm wondering if you have an insight into what is it that intrigues mathematicians about music when the math itself is fairly trivial?
Well, I think maybe it's a new sensation of what the math is providing. It's actually providing a sensation. It's actually providing something that can be experienced. And so, to the extent that this might actually be coming from mathematicians, well, let me share with you that I admire math, but I have not actively studied math for many, many years, ever since high school. And yet I feel like I have kind of an affinity for what math shows by my appreciation of number systems within music, because I can observe the numbers actually at work. There's like some real thing that comes from the way the numbers are being combined and manipulated.
Yeah. Now, we should mention that as we move through the 20th century into the 21st, there were some composers, I'm thinking Persichetti, Dalla Piccola, some of these people actually did take complex math and turn it into music with varying results.
Exactly. Well, I mean, eventually over time, there seems to be a way of viewing music history as a desire to experiment more and more with the tools and the resources of music to the extent that opening the idea that maybe dissonance kind of can exist on its own and that dissonance can be expressive within and of itself. If one is able to kind of take that on board and allow dissonance to kind of just be an independent quality unto itself, there seemed to be the greater notion coming from the genius of Arnold Schoenberg that maybe all 12 pitches could be exactly equal, all kind of 12 pitches represented by 12 chromatic notes up and down an octave. And that as such, maybe there would be a way of, like, in a consistent sort of way, using all 12 pitches so that each pitch, once stated, would not be used again until the other 11 pitches have been used. And thus was born the idea of 12-tone music, which relies on an ordered system of the pitches. As I said, once one pitch is used, like C sharp, you don't C sharp happen again until you've used up all of the other 11 pitches surrounding it, and in their own kind of order. And then seeing this kind of 12-tone process take shape, that's where the music can possibly become more mathematically driven. If music is kind of rendered that way in terms of math, then the question is it still heard as music, or is it heard kind of as data? Is it just information that's flowing between our ears? So to keep it in terms of a human kind of product, something that tells us about our humanity, as it were, I think that takes a separate level of genius in terms of composition, to be able to use such mathematically derived principles, but to still keep it as humanly connected as possible, to still keep it as art for the sake of art itself.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting to me. There are, of course, innumerable pieces that are standard in the 17th, 18th, 19th century that we have forgotten because while they are pretty, they offer nothing to us. They were as quickly forgotten as they were written. And there are very few pieces that we hold up, and I'm not sure whether rightly or wrongly, but I think over time I've found there are some pieces that you can keep coming back to that do have something about them that is more powerful. And this is no different when we start using more math. Just because we have a system in place, and of course, Schoenberg called it his method, not a system. He didn't want it to churn out pieces in the 12-tone system, but that this be a method of composition using all 12 tones. Yeah, he worked really hard to make sure his pieces were pieces of music. And there are a few, you mentioned Messiaen, people who worked really hard to make sure it was music and not just, hey, I had this system I tried and the math is great, so you'll hear it.
Exactly. And so that level of attaining a kind of balance, as it were, between, well, science and yet art, this is what keeps drawing me back to the study of music again and again and again and again. It's just endlessly fascinating. And I'm so glad to be able to have the ability to keep pursuing that study, but then also to share that with students.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, music theory, Western music theory has taken a hit lately, and I'm not going to say that it's not entirely deserved. There are some people who are criticizing the hierarchical, monolithic nature of Western classical. It's seen as the best music, the theory, and it's very dependent on a lot of cultural assumptions that are not necessarily true across the board. There's even been some calls that Western music theory is racist to some extent. And there's an argument to be made for it, whether you agree or not. There's a cogent argument for it. What's your take on this?
Well, I understand that argument being made, and I have to agree that the kind of culture that produced a lot of the music that we've heard over the years and that we've become accustomed to, well, I mean, that culture that produced that kind of music itself was perhaps unjust and unfortunate in that regard. I ask myself, would I want to live in that time period that produced those pieces themselves? Usually I have to say, probably not. It would probably not be as good a world as what we live in nowadays. For example, it's an imperfect world that we live in now, but there are ways that it's actually better and becoming better through just dint of striving for a kind of more equal system of justice and just a better world for everybody in the world itself. So if the description of music that comes from that is as a result of observing that music, then maybe it is actually time to rethink, what are we describing? And in describing that, how can we put it in context with other things? Now, I love classical music. I love the music of the great composers that I have always admired. What I recognize is maybe that it is just only one group of composers and one segment of music making within the world as a whole that might have beauty and truth to kind of offer the human experience. So I was a little bit skeptical at first in the early days of kind of redefining this kind of new approach to what is valid or what is kind of justified in terms of musical viewpoints. And yet I find more and more as I allow myself the option of seeing it as a greater set of choices. Maybe this is kind of like thinking about music theory and like the organ again, where music, if I view it as a certain set of choices, the more choices that I see in front of me, the more I enjoy it and the more I feel validated by this open approach more than anything else. So I will take an example here that you may or may not recall this, but I love cinema. I love film. I just kind of just take in movies. And so recently I was enjoying a three-part series called Carlos, a kind of retelling of the life of the international terrorist known as Carlos. This is a recent production from the last 10 or 15 years or so. The main actor who plays him, Edgar Ramirez, very fine actor, doing a very fine job of presenting this very challenging individual, but a very compelling individual. Well, the soundtrack for that production was just imbued with some wonderful choices of music. Some of them not Western based, some music that is drawn from, for example, Northern African kind of sources. And finding that I just love the sound of this stuff. I was hugely interested in thinking, what's going on with that sound? Why does it captivate my interest so much? And in fact, it's mainly because of the departures from what I'm accustomed to in certain ways. And so one of the soundtracks shows the capabilities of an instrument from North Africa called the kora. This is usually described as a 21-stringed instrument, but it's maybe sometimes more than that. And so the greatest kind of analogy that it might have within the Western musical experience is to analogize it to either a guitar or a harp. And knowing that it doesn't have exactly the same tuning system that we think of in terms of equal temperament tuning from the West. And it's that quality, that just change of sound, that anything coming from that, it just captivates my ear at the moment. And I am so glad to be able to know that there's a larger world that's out there as a result of this.
Yes, I'm fully in agreement. And I also want to point out the dangers of this because as a theorist, you and I also would be just dying to get in there and understand it. Can I find a way to explain what I'm hearing? And I hope I'm gonna get the title of this book read. I read it quite some time ago, John Blacking, How Musical is Man. He gives a wonderful example of, I think it's West African drumming, and a theoretical approach to try to understand it, which turned out to be completely wrong. The rules they inferred from what they were studying, and they analyzed it, and it was wrong. It had nothing to do with what these people who are drumming were actually doing. Should we be using music theory on everything?
Well, what I would offer, maybe this is a different interpretation of what you're telling me here. I think music is a rich kind of entity, and that in its richness, it's open to multiple interpretive points of view. When a composer creates a piece, yes, they are kind of presenting a combination of sounds that they are responsible for, but it is definitely the case that there is more than one way of listening to a piece of music or experiencing a body of music, such that in terms of the author that you described, his experience of describing the music that he believed that he was hearing, I would have to give validation to the system of his description if he found it validifying, and if he found that it was something that allowed him to understand better or even enriched his experience of that music even though the system of analysis may have nothing to do with like the source of the music itself, the music, the way that the music was created itself. One of the things about music theory, I think, that is possibly enriching is offering different points of view. And this includes points of view that may be different from the composer, him or herself. It's a very striking idea that maybe the composer is not fully aware of all the implications of the very piece that they create. I think this is actually true. And so, to the extent that once a composer creates a piece is the product of a culture, maybe there's actually more than one way of viewing that piece or thinking about the makeup of that piece.
I love this answer. I do want to put a caution on it. First of all, I'm not sure Blacking was the one who analyzed the music. I think he was citing an example. But the problem with what these theorists were doing was they were using their theory to explain and predict the music they were hearing without ever understanding it themselves. In other words, rather than just saying, here's another way of describing it, like I painted a portrait that's different from the portrait, they said, this is what they are doing, and this is what this means, and this is, if I want to compose music like them, if I follow my rules, I'm going to end up with, and so it was a poor description. And so there's the danger, right? When we try to tell someone from West Africa, here's what you're actually doing. And like, well, I've been drumming for 50 years, man. I know what I'm doing.
Well, in that way, as you describe it that way, it would seem, yes, there is the danger of presumption, and that would always be dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but in a sense, though, this is what music theory does too, though. We have to, we're going and we're telling Mozart what we think Mozart meant, right? And we're even assigning some rules to Mozart.
I'm knowing the very rules that Mozart himself followed. So, under the best circumstances, again, it all depends upon the composer and the context and the kind of body of music that's being described. But under the best circumstances, the kind of statements that we make in music theory are kind of like a further extension of the very compositional systems that produced that music in the first place. Now, if you were to ask me, what was Mozart thinking when he wrote a particular piece? I have no idea. I might as well use seance as an analytical technique, and ask Mozart with candlelight, what were you thinking? And wait for the table to shake in order to get my answer about what Mozart was thinking at that kind of moment in time. But what we can explain are the things that we can measure within the music. So again, we go back to these number-based relationships. They do have, I think, a place still in thinking about how the music is constructed.
I've got a great example, and I want to bring this up. I've been dying to talk about this with someone, and you're the guy. I forget whose YouTube channel it was. He was examining Glenn Gould and his approach to Mozart, and he asked Seymour Bernstein his opinion on Glenn Gould. Seymour Bernstein, 90-something-year-old pianist, marvelous musician, brilliant mind. He didn't like Gould's playing at all, and he didn't have any problem saying so. He said something that really riled me. He was talking about Mozart's famous piano sonata, that the slow movement, which goes da na 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 na. He said, "This is an unwritten rule of the universe. It must be played like this: da na 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 da na 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 da." Now Gould played it like this, just probably to be a jerk. Da na 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 da na 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 na. Da, na, na, na. Now I'm thinking, okay, Gould brought out something in that music that I hadn't heard before. That structure has been, what's the word, modified somewhat so that you hear something in that music you didn't hear before. But here's Seymour saying, no, if you do that, that's madness. Then anything can reign. Then you miss the beauty of the melody because you're too busy fooling around with it. What do you think?
Well, I think Glenn Gould was able to see that, as I said, that music has multiple interpretations that are available to it. And maybe, in fact, I'll just offer this interpretation. There's not a way that I can prove this necessarily. I would imagine that what might have been going through Glenn Gould's head at the time is to experiment with different ways of seeing the same thing. And I would ask, in visual art, was this any different than what Picasso was doing in terms of Cubist painting and Cubist drawings, if I can make an analogy here? So must painting always be representational necessarily? Apparently the answer is no. It can actually represent an impression or an image or kind of the essence of what we see in front of us. And so by taking a common object and turning it at a different angle and seeking a new understanding of something by viewing it from a different angle. Let's replace the words. Maybe we hear a common object, a common melody, something that we are very familiar with over time, like that melody by Mozart, but then hearing it in a slightly different way because it's giving a different shape, a different articulation, a different phrasing to it. I think in that way, that's where I think that Glenn Gould was justified. And I would hold that um, the the eventual result of that, one does not have to agree with it on a fundamental level, but I absolutely invite the interpretation that produces that different result.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought the art analogy up because there are people out there who have been public on the internet to say that, basically Picasso led us all down a path of madness. And the great paintings of the past, which relied on what they considered to be skill because it's representational, was lost. And now anything goes. And now we have paintings of squares. I understand the validity of that viewpoint. However, having, studied art in detail, there are paintings of squares and then there's paintings of squares, and there really is a difference if you take the time. Um, what do you think? I mean, is there a danger of just opening up, if you let the genie out of the bottle, aren't you inviting mediocrity to reign?
Well, I suppose there's the danger of that, although I guess the truth is in the telling and finding out what lasts over time. So earlier in our conversation, you cited music of past centuries that is fairly forgotten, and maybe rightly so. So music that existed in a certain time in a certain place, where if we don't remember about that music, maybe there was a reason for that. So I am willing to kind of take the bet long term that mediocrity will just kind of pass away with the sands of time, and what is timeless and classic will remain in place. So I understand the kind of danger of just kind of opening up creative systems to anything that seems possible. I actually think that if people are describing the creation of art or music that way, they may be missing something. They may be missing the expression of a certain idea. They may be missing that there is usually a kind of inspiration behind that idea, and that inspiration is what explains the work of art, whether it be the piece of music or the painting or a piece of literature, for example. So this is something that has been on my bucket list to do, and I am nowhere near of even starting it, let alone completing it in this year of 2022, the anniversary year of Ulysses by James Joyce. I can say that I have not read even a whole chapter of that book. Adam, have you read that book?
I have. In fact, I read it just last year after waiting many years to do it.
Okay. Well, please correct me if I'm wrong, but are there not some challenging passages within that book?
Oh, immensely challenging. And of course, Finnegan's Wake, the sequel, is even more challenging. And the question is, Ulysses seems to have gained a certain respect, but then again, it may be respected by people who have never read it and are afraid to criticize it. There's the other side, right? So I think, yes, I was very moved by parts of Ulysses. Parts of it I just went ahead and read and said, yeah, yeah, yeah. But of course, if you study Ulysses, you know the immense structure that's behind it. He took eight years at least to write the thing, and it was not haphazard or random by any account, even if it appears so.
Exactly. Well, what I understand is that there are parts in the immediate experience of what he wrote that kind of make us question what he was doing. And it makes it seem as if he was deliberately kind of either upending rules or ignoring the rules, and therefore anything goes, as you say. Now, I trust that, knowing what I know about James Joyce, that he did everything with a purpose, with intention, and that it's not a case of anything goes. That if a composer or an artist or a writer like James Joyce is doing with something with intention, that what may not seem logical to us on the face of it, there is a reason why it exists. And I am dedicated to getting to that reason, at least when it comes to music that seems this way.
Okay, but I'm going to take devil's advocate. Doesn't allowing this to happen destroy traditions that have power and strength in them? And here's a troubled example. The pedagogy of the piano from the late 19th century to the early 20th century was basically one of neuroticism. These pianists were punished and punished themselves, but they were also just stellar pianists. There has been some loosening of training of pianists over time so that they don't have to kill themselves anymore. And the question is, when you do that, do you lose great artistry, at least in the main? Like the average pianist, are they as good as the average pianist back then, even though they were neurotic and crazy?
I think it's different pathways to the same hoped for result. So, I mean, what I would say is, what is the end result? What is that goal? How do we attain that art, that high level of experience that we seek, that thing that is timeless and that is classic? I would hope that over time, people figure out how to do things better and maybe in a different way, in a more humane way. So if there are changes in, say, piano pedagogy, I would hope that those changes have been kind of brought about with the desire of people treating themselves better, maybe making themselves less frenetic in terms of nerves, maybe treating their muscles better, maybe being able to produce a result that can be reproduced as pianists train each other to be better piano teachers over time.